Say that again.
I have 47 pages of notes.
Good. Great. All right. Court Carney, welcome to Definitely Dylan. I'm so glad we're finally recording an episode because I think we've spoken about various topics through the years. And I always said, oh, you should come on. We should talk about this. And then it never happened.
No, it's fun. This seems like a meaty one, right?
Yes. And this came about because you actually sent in a question to the Bob Dylan hotline. And then I said, do you maybe just want to do an episode, like, have a conversation about this?
You're like, this one denied. However, would you like to do this?
Exactly. Do you want to repeat your question or kind of introduce the topic that you're interested in?
Well, the idea was, and this is sort of for everyone, this is sort of a works in progress. So this would be kind of fun part of it. But it touches and dovetails with so much kind of what we talk about. But the original question was something along the lines of, how does Dylan's work play into nostalgia? Does nostalgia have an impact on Dylan? I don't think we can really say anything about Dylan as a nostalgist because I don't think that's true, but I do think it's an interesting discourse. And I do think there's all these places where nostalgia sort of touches. And either he's rebelling against it or people are trying to make him into something that is nostalgic. I just love the idea of it and this idea of memory and this idea of nostalgia and how these things are blurry. And how obviously the audience and audience expectations play into this, which I think is actually probably ultimately the biggest issue here, but we can get into that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're a history professor. Is
Yes.
nostalgia generally something that you think comes into your work? Where do you see the boundary between history, nostalgia? Is one just a kind of more an attempt at a more objective view of the past, and nostalgia is obviously a lot more sentimental? Or
So you want to start with a dissertation topic? Yeah, this is huge, right? A lot of my work, going back to even in grad school in the 90s, is like around memory, public memory, how memories are constructed, but also like how are they represented in public life with statues and monuments, which isn't nostalgia. But then nostalgia is, if we want to talk about this idea of like, I think the word that keeps coming up is like a yearning, right? Or like a romantic appeal to a particular time in the past. That's a little, I mean, it's obviously shaped by memory, but they are sort of distinct, or they play different roles. And I don't think until you have a 13-point definition of memory and a 13-point definition of nostalgia, can you really tease them out? And that's not really our purposes. But this idea of how do people look at the past? How do people feel the past, which is a very personal thing, but then how does that rise to sort of a more social construct, I think is kind of where we're at in this conversation. I mean, Dylan is clearly one of, if not our most historically minded songwriters, popular singers. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody that comes close to his depth of how he views history and how history kind of imbues so much of what he does. But that's not the same as nostalgia. And having a nostalgic viewpoint is very different than having a discerning viewpoint of the past. And I think that's kind of what we can get into today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, do you want to start us off with anything, or should I start us off?
Well, I can tell you the starting point for me.
Please.
The starting point for me is very recent. There is a collection of essays being built and on late period Dylan. And I had something in mind, but I didn't pitch it. And then the editors reached out and were like, do you have anything? And I said, I have this one idea. And the idea involves the Christmas record. And this idea of Dylan's Christmas record, which predates the Sinatra songbook records. And I was like, that's always been kind of interesting. And so if we just put parentheses around the Christmas record, this idea of kind of what he's doing, which is always seen either through an ironic perspective, which he completely denies, There's that great interview when he's like, "You don't get anything I do." I think this is ironic, but people kind of look at it as like a joke or satire. But then the Christmas record is sort of mining some of this in terms of the iconography, in terms of the images, in terms of how it's kind of presented. And he's not creating this, I don't think, but it's playing within all of this. And I think that uh, that was the idea I started with. It was like, well, what if we look at sort of a nostalgia or like an anti-nostalgic impulse within this world with the Christmas record? Because I also think it'd be fun to talk about and play with, because I think that's such a specific point in his career, especially kind of what it opens up into. And so then that became the question of like, well, what do we really mean by this? And how do we, I mean, ultimately, kind of like to your other question, how do we measure this? Like, this isn't scientific. So how do we, it's a 6.3 on the nostalgic score. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. And one person's nostalgia is someone else's memory, or someone else's memory is someone else's nostalgia. I mean, that's kind of bullshit too, but I think that there's a place to have this conversation.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean, because I think nostalgia is almost. Hmm. I was going to say nostalgia is subjective, but I don't. I think that's only half true, because I think when something invokes a certain yearning, I think it reads as nostalgic to us. So
Right.
it's definitely not. It's definitely not. It's, but whether it speaks to you, I guess it still depends on whether you want to tap into that or not. But I think I know what you mean, because, for example, with the Christmas record, there is a sincerity in the way Dylan evokes like those very old timey sounds. Yeah, in a very sincere or earnest way. But at the same time, it's not pastiche. And I don't think it is. And I don't think he means it to be nostalgic, although I think when it comes to Christmas, I think nostalgia is maybe even a desired emotion to bring into it, because like I think
Yeah.
we're all I think Christmas, if you celebrated it as a child, that is probably the time of year where you're most and you have happy memories, I suppose. Then I think you're more receptive to wanting to feel that again, or to kind of share in that nostalgia. But yeah, I
Which
think.
makes people think it's universal. That's where it gets
Mm,
tricky, because you
yeah,
feel like,
yeah.
well, everyone has these feelings. Like, well, no, that's not necessarily true. But if you go back, and if Mad Men has taught us anything, how many minutes into this has Mad
Yes.
Men started?
Yes.
This idea, the most famous early Mad Men episode, which is the pain from an old wound, right?
Mm.
And there's a truthfulness to that. If we go back to the early definitions of nostalgia, which is
We have to we
interesting.
have to
Yep.
we have to explain that Court is a big Mad Men fan. I'm also a big Mad Men fan.
I think,
We
you you know,
we have had
you,
conversations about Mad Men. We've
you
been
you
trying
are
we've been trying to bring Mad Men onto this podcast for a while.
That's another essay. But
Yeah.
you are so well known in terms of Dylan. But I think probably 75% of our conversations are about the Beatles.
Yes, true.
Probably 25% are about Mad Men, and
Mm,
the remainder or whatever turns into Dylan sometimes. But
yeah.
this idea of Mad Men talking about the pain of, which is fascinating, right? Because Mad Men is a 2000s presentation of the 60s,
Hmm.
and it touches on nostalgia oftentimes it doesn't. But this idea of pain from an old wound, which is fascinating too, because that goes back to the Greek, which goes back to, wait for it, the Odyssey.
Odyssey.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
yes. You bet that I was going to bring that up.
There's one thing that lights up the board, right? It's Dylan and the Odyssey, and this sort of like homesickness, right, or this like pain of a returning home.
Hmm.
This all begins to be part of this story, and I think that where Dylan, if we just want to go to the end immediately, I think Dylan's connection to nostalgia uh, requires us to understand Dylan's relationship to modernity. And if you have an understanding of Dylan in the modern age, in the biggest picture, and if you think of Dylan's relationship to the past, Dylan's relationship to the present, nostalgia, it doesn't play into that, I don't
Hmm.
think.
Yeah.
And I don't think, if we could talk about everything, if we want to talk about Dylan and Homecoming, we start with Song to Woody, and this idea of he's or the great interview where he's like, I was born far from where
Yeah.
I, you know, that's bedrock to us, right? In terms of our
Yeah.
understanding of him, and nostalgia doesn't really touch that so easily.
Yeah, I was going to say, I want us to work our way towards Dylan and modernity, because I think that is where we're bound to end up. Yeah, let's just repeat this for the people who maybe aren't as familiar. So, nostalgia, the etymology of that word comes from the Greek nostos, which is homecoming, and then algia, which is pain or grief. So, nostalgia literally translates to either homesickness or a grieving for a home that you cannot return to.
Right.
And I think I also came across this Sontag quote that said, the nostalgia is enamored of distance, not of the referent itself. Nostalgia cannot be sustained without loss.
Mm.
So nostalgia as a feeling requires that there has been a loss, that there is a home that cannot easily be returned to, either in this particular moment or at all. And I think nowadays we mostly apply the term less to a certain place, but we rather apply it to a time in our life that has passed and therefore cannot be repeated or returned to. But if we stay with this literal origin for a second, this longing or searching for home, because as you already hinted at, I think this is something that Dylan has toyed with or has referred to many times, particularly in the 21st century. And I think that's very interesting. He begins the No Direction Home documentary with an interview where he says, I was born very far from where I'm supposed to be, so now I'm on my way home. And then later he makes it even clearer and says, I had ambitions to set out and find like an Odyssey or going home somewhere, set out to find this home that I'd left a while back and couldn't remember exactly where it was, but I was on my way there. And encountering what I encountered on the way was how I envisioned it all. I didn't really have any ambition at all. Also, by the way, that's so Dylan, right? Like envision it all. I didn't have any ambition at all. Like that in of itself is already such a great rhyme.
It's a great rhyme, but it's also like this cosmic searching. He's like, I wasn't ambitious. It's like, what are you talking? I mean, you just
Yeah, yeah.
crafted
Uh,
this.
well, yeah. That's actually, by the time this comes out, the last Bob Dylan hotline will already be out. We talk about that as well, actually. So it all ties in, all makes sense. No, but so Homer's Odyssey recounts the story of Odysseus, the epic hero, and his men who embark on a dangerous journey full of trials and tribulations in order to make their way home to native Ithaca, where Odysseus wants to reunite with his wife and his son and his dog. And, I'm saying this to the listener. I know you know all of this code. Colloquially, the Odyssey has become synonymous with any arduous journey, but Bob Dylan is deliberately using it to refer to going home. And that is also really what the theme of the Odyssey is. It is about this journey home. It's not just any difficult journey. It is this longing for a home that Odysseus wants to return to. And crucially, the Odyssey is also one of the three books that Bob Dylan mentions in his Nobel lecture. And there he kind of reiterates again that he sees himself as an Odysseus like figure. And of course, I mean, I think alone, if we look at Bob Dylan's day to day life as someone who's constantly on the road, constantly traveling, the parallels are pretty obvious. But in his Nobel lecture, he specifically again returns to this theme of home. And he says, the Odyssey is a great book whose themes have worked its way into the ballads of a lot of songwriters. Homeward Bound, Green, Green Grass of Home, Home on the Range, and my songs as well. Right. So again, he returns to this idea of home. And specifically in the songs that he mentions, there is a nostalgia that's connected to this home that the singer wants to return to. And the last thing that I'm going to mention before, I throw the ball to you again, is that I think in this context, it's also very interesting to me that in the philosophy of modern song, the song that he chose to begin the book with is Detroit City by Bobby Bear, which has the chorus of I want to go home. And I think it's so interesting that he puts that song at the very front of the book. And in the two halves of the chapter, he writes, the first half is the so-called riff, where he basically just kind of like sums up what the song is about in his own words. And then in the second half, he kind of gives more of an interpretation, or a an outside view of it. And there he writes, and I think this is kind of interesting. He says, "This is not so much the song of a dreamer, but the song of someone who is caught up in a fantasy of the way things used to be. But the listener knows that it just doesn't exist. There is no mother, no dear old papa, sister, or brother. They are all either dead or gone. The girl that he's dreaming about long ago got married to a divorce attorney, and she has 3 kids. Like thousands of others, he left the farm, came to the big city to get ahead, and got lost. That's why the song works." And I think this, when he says at the end, that's why this song works. It's and I'd love to hear what you think of this conclusion to the chapter, because the way I see it is that he's basically saying, um, well, for one, the song is clever in displaying a certain yearning that we see is a yearning for something that doesn't exist anymore, and at the same time, that we all have the capacity to tap into that kind of pain of missing something that we can't go back to. And from that place, it's just a matter of like whether or not we want to indulge in those feelings or not.
But yeah, it's also like that he realizes the songwriter is in on it.
Yeah.
Like if you see it as simply yearning, you've kind of missed the point. Um,
Hmm.
right? Like he's kind of like you're kind of in on this other thing, and I think that entire collection of essays, the entire philosophy of modern sound, is a big of a song is sort of the maybe the key example of this, right? Because the way he connects the songs, but also the visual material in that book,
Hmm.
I think it's fascinating. Though it's a great representative of how he views the past.
Yeah.
And I know that Grayley, our friend Grayley, of course, has done some really good work on some of the stuff in there. Jim Salvucci did a paper on nostalgia within this too. So there's a lot there,
Hmm.
but it feels like he's sort of, you think it's about this, but it's really about that, right? That's sort of
Hmm.
the sleight of hand of what he's doing. And we've talked before we started talking, we started recording. We were talking about another essay in there, which is very specifically about this, and that's what you brought up, the
Hmm.
Ricky Nelson song too. And so he's obviously thinking about that. And then the images he's using, it's like the Christmas record where he's going to use the Betty Page image, and he's going to use this kind of old fashioned looking Christmas card image. But then it's like a little bit of a wink and a nod. And there's a little bit of it's not just this, but then he's going to sing the music as straightforwardly as you would think he would, just because these are the songs that matter. And I think if you look at the backdrop of that Christmas record, it's kind of like this is what we wanted to do because we wanted to be true to the music. So we
Hmm. I
we
think
did it this way.
I
But I
think
think
one
he's
thing
talking
that
about these different layers of these songs. It's a song like some of these songs that he talks about are not necessarily all that dense, but there's
yeah.
another layer to it that he at least he's picking up on.
Yeah. I think one thing that I just wanted to add is that what's interesting with the Christmas record is because we talk about the almost faithfulness with the imagery of the instrumentation, of the sincerity in the approach to the material. But I think what all of this circles around is the fact that Bob Dylan is singing these songs, and he's singing them with his voice. And that voice is so anachronistic, because no one in the 40s would have sounded like this. No one in the 40s or 50s would have gotten a record contract sounding like Bob Dylan. He carries in his voice his entire story, and therefore also our collective cultural memory of what Bob Dylan means to culture. and
Exactly.
and therefore when he sings these songs, he kind of like challenges us to reckon with kind of reconciling the two, the past on the one hand, and then everything that Bob Dylan stands for, including, the quote unquote voice of the 60s,
Right.
and the protest movement. And then also stuff like, oh, Bob Dylan can't sing, but now he's here and singing.
In
Uh,
Latin.
yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
But it's also, I think you make a good point too, because he would, if he made this record like with his Nashville Skyline voice, or even if he did it with like his Love and Theft voice, but he's making this record when he's kind of in that Tempest zone,
Mhm.
where it's a very it is not an for everyone's pleasant listening experience, perhaps. But I think that's kind of from his perspective.
It's
He's
an
like, well, this is
acquired
what.
taste, is what we like to call it here.
Now remember, like this was pitched as like what's a Christmas. Everyone wants a Christmas record, so you're going to go to Starbucks and pick this up or whatever. I
Mhm.
mean, that seems like a million years ago now. But I
Yeah,
think that's absolutely right. What you're listening to is not just Dylan performing these songs; is what you want to bring to Dylan at
yeah.
all. And so
And
it's
the
like, well,
same
why
is
this?
true.
Why not? Yeah.
And the same is true for the American Songbook records, Shadows in the Night and Fallen Angels and Triplicate, because I mean, even though I think he's making an effort to uh, mold his voice to those songs, but he is never being anyone but himself,
Mhm.
and I mean, that reminds me of that interview quote, all I can be is me, whoever that is, right? But it is true. I mean, Dylan is a performer and he's going to any song that he approaches, the best thing he can do is approach them as Bob Dylan and sing them in his own voice.
And most of those songs are his touring band, so he's not even trying to replicate
Yeah,
the
yeah.
strings or anything. It's like, no, we're going to do the touring band and we'll have pedals still here or this. And I mean, I think musically those work really well.
Ugh, I think they're so underrated, and I think the creativity of the approach to those songs got underestimated or kind of like not talked about enough because people were so preoccupied with the fact that it's Dylan, quote unquote, singing Sinatra. So I think it was almost like the idea of these albums overshadowed the actual achievement of these albums, which I think, I mean, I love going back to them, and I'm always like really taken with how beautiful they are.
And also how fast they come out. It's like one a year. It's like 15, 16, and
Yeah.
17. Then it ends with like these three records that
Yeah, he
I
was
know a lot
serious
of people
about
probably
it.
have not gone through, but um,
Yeah.
it's fascinating though. It's the same kind of thing where he's like, here is I'm pitching a version of the past that is not beholden to the past, but is also true to the past. Like the idea of a real traditional narrative, like there are things of the past that are worth keeping. The,
Hmm.
the small c conservatism of there are things that we must honor that are true to us.
Hmm.
That's not the same thing as like, well, the 50s were great. Because if you read, the Philosophy of Modern Song, there's so many pieces where he's like showing the mirror of like, well, we said this, but really it was this chaos and the violence and all of that. And I think if there's anybody, even when he's in his 20s, young 20s, he seems to be very connected to this idea of the past is a violent place,
Hmm.
that the violence of the past is kind of the definition of what we take from it. I think that's why he's connected to like All Quiet on the Western Front, Moby Dick,
Interesting.
Two Soldiers, right?
Hmm.
All the early folk songs he's doing, we kind of typecast them as like murder ballads, but it's also kind of like these are these violent stories that he's also writing himself. And when we talk about, I mean, violence in Dylan is a whole other chapter, but I think there's
Hmm.
something to that where he
Hmm.
sees the past as a very peculiar place that we must confront to have any understanding, but we also need to confront it on its own terms, which means that language that may not translate well is up for grabs. I think the language use in Philosophy of Modern Song is, we can all imagine a couple of places, but I mean, I think it's important. That's why he's using the language he does, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it would be right to say that maybe in some nostalgic views of history or of the past, it's almost like the past gets stripped of, not stripped of humanity, but stripped of kind of like the reality of like what human beings are like. And I think that what you find in these folk songs, for example, is the cruelty that is innate to human beings, and they don't let us forget that used to be in us and it still is within us. We have this capacity for violence, for cruelty, for anger, for spite, and all of these things, and by bringing them to the present, I think it helps us hopefully relate to the past as not something remote, but something that uh, stays current, because it's, at its heart, it's human beings. And human beings
Right.
don't change all that much, really. And I
Right.
think that's at the heart of like something like the lines in My Own Version of You, the song that I keep coming back to because it's such a great song. But stand over there by the cypress tree where the Trojan women and children were sold into slavery long before the first crusade, way back before England or America were made. I think that is what he's writing about. It's like it is a cyclical nature to history, and we're really not as far removed and not as evolved as we believe ourselves to be from the human beings that we read about in either history books or in epic poems like the Odyssey.
Right. Well, I think it's also why some of these songs are disconnected to place, like let's say Black Rider or something. There's
Mhm,
songs that like they do seem ancient and mythic. I go back to Two Soldiers a lot. When he does Two Soldiers, it's like it's any war. It could be anything because the mother's going to send the kid off or the kid's going to leave
mm.
home. I mean, that's a non-homecoming song.
Yeah, and John Brown also
John
falls
Brown,
into, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, John Brown. It's not John Brown, but it's John Brown. You're going to bring to your song the idea of John Brown, but it's not about John Brown.
Hmm.
But then it is about John Brown, right? And the thing,
Hmm.
and that's again, that's not a new song for him. And I think this is where you're talking about this idea of like we want a bloodless past,
Hmm.
but we also for some reason can't accept that as true. I think that's the disconnect with nostalgia for a lot of people. It's like when you look back at like in the 1970s and we were talking about this earlier too, but in the 1970s when you start seeing questions of nostalgia
Hmm.
and you start seeing package tours and you start seeing kind of the oldies acts being created. The 70s were very keen on looking at the 50s, which there's an argument that every generation is 20 years removed, blah 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 blah.
Hmm.
This idea that the 70s was obsessed with the 50s, Sha Na Na, Happy Days, American Graffiti. But that becomes this point when they're like, you know what, we know that's not real. But I don't think that everyone thinks that. If you look at Mad Men, there's that really key scene where they litter. They're at the
Hmm.
picnic
Yeah.
and they just litter. And I can't tell you, I think once a week on Reddit, someone's like, "Can you believe they do that?" Because they're missing the interaction, the discourse there of like, well, this is how people used to be. We're not removed from that, but we feel like we've kind of prettied it up. I'm not making a real argumentative point here, but I think
No,
there's
I hear
something
you.
interesting in all of this that
Yeah.
Dylan sort of somehow, intentionally or not, kind of zags when it zigs, zigs when it zags, and he doesn't really touch it.
I Yeah, I mean, I think you said we want a bloodless past, and I think I would also add to that. I think we want a neat past. We want something that spells out a story, which means that we create a story that makes sense of
Yes.
past actions. When like very rarely that was the very rarely is there one story that is correct from all angles, right? I
Right.
mean, I hope I can say that to you as a
Well,
historian.
well, this is where Ralph Ellison has this really beautiful quote where he says that's why we have two visions of the past. One is marble and it's clean cut and everyone it looks pretty and makes sense and is coherent, and then we have one that is as chaotic as our present because our
Hmm.
present's chaotic and we
Yeah.
understand that, but for some reason we don't want to put that on our grandparents, and just in
Hmm.
terms of the chaotic nature of things. And then when you also have the modern existence of this, a lot of this is like a normative, right? So it's a white normative. In the United States, it's a white normative impression of the 50s of like, isn't that great when the police were happy and everyone was kind and all it worked? But if you take away the white normative structure of that,
Hmm.
none of that makes sense.
Yeah.
I
And
think
that's where
that
there's so much clashing at the moment, right? Yeah.
exactly
Sorry.
there's a clash because there is a vision that you want to buy into that is maybe you don't know, but you have in your gut is not real, but it you know there's also like that meme where it's like local guy is nostalgic for a time when he was in appreciably worse shape, right? Like everything about his life now is so much better, but I really wish it was 2004 again.
Mhm.
um, and I think that all plays into it. So when you at the very beginning, where you're like, is this a personal or a structural, or is this I think it's both of those things. I think a lot about this conversation skips around like Proust and the Madeline, right? Like his
Hmm.
connection to that cookie is a very personal story. It's a personal journey to
Hmm.
all of that. But there are things that we kind of are a little bit larger that we can kind of say, well, how does this connect to us as a people? Where do we come from as a nation, for example? I said oldies a second ago, but the idea of oldies radio is kind of a fascinating take on it. Classic rock.
Yeah.
These appellations become entrenched in genre, or genre becomes entrenched in appellations. But this idea of what does that even mean, and why is that so interesting for people?
Hmm. Yeah, I think I wonder if it isn't because I think a nostalgic worldview lets you off the hook from taking responsibility for your future, maybe. Because I think if you yearn for a version that used to be and you cling to that as the ideal, then I think you're facing the wrong direction. You're not
That's
you're
interesting.
not you're not facing the right way. And this is actually just before we got on here, I texted you saying I'm trying to make sense of what I meant when I took down the note, the paradox of nostalgia. I remembered because I think this is actually exactly what I mean by that. Because Bob
Yeah.
Dylan stands as an artist is kind of in between, constantly looking back and constantly looking ahead, because he is a historian and he is doing so much work trying to preserve cultural memory and trying to not let us forget about the music that came before mass media,
Right.
trying to preserve obviously the folk tradition as well, like in his own songs, and kind of and preserve that way of working and that way of listening and that way of engaging people. So there's a lot of memory work going on, but at the same time he's constantly trying to move forward. And I think, and this is maybe what you were trying to get at when you were talking about Dylan's relationship to modernity, because I think that is because for him the past is not a dead place. The past, he is not grieving for the past. The past to him is not unattainable or a place that cannot be returned to. Rather, he returns to it quite often. He revisits it. It's for him, it's alive and breathing.
Yes. Yes.
And so therefore, when he does projects like Shadow Kingdom, which is him revisiting his the early songs, or even the way he performs his own songs in concert, he's not repeating himself when he plays these old songs, because to him the songs are alive, and he says songs are alive in the land of the living, and he is practicing that. He is showing constantly how alive the past really is by doing all this work, like all the work with Theme Time Radio Hour, with the philosophy of modern song, where he approaches some of these songs with truly creative readings, and I think we have not collectively processed enough like how great of a work the philosophy of modern song is. But that's for another time. Yeah,
But I
thoughts.
think I think what this gets to exactly is what you were saying is kind of like it requires us to detach from like a linear concept of time.
Yeah.
Like it's like this, then this, then this, and he doesn't really operate that way or see it that way, as far as we can tell. And it's also that's the tricky part. I mean, you don't have to be Vonnegut, but Vonnegut plays with that all the time. This idea of you're kind of in and out of history, time out of mind.
Mm.
You're in time, you're out of time. What's that great quote about? I think you and Rebecca were talking about this idea of time and film that Dylan talks about. This idea um, of what this means, and it reminds me of something else I was going to bring up with this. But I think a linear concept of time is like we can go back to this moment,
Yes.
or we
Yeah.
can't go back to this moment. But
Hmm.
if it's not linear, you can always go back to that moment because
Hmm.
you're it's detached from that. There's the gravity's off. It doesn't work that way.
I
And from
want
a
to.
historical perspective, that's challenging. From a philosophical perspective, it's challenging, but it's also kind of liberating. I suppose you're like, well, the past is the old Soviet joke of like the past is all that's up for grabs, right? Like
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
the past is unpredictable. That's the whole
Hmm.
idea, which
That's so
doesn't play
great.
well in your 1,000 level U.S. history class. And so it's like, just tell me what's on the test. Um,
The one song that I think is really interesting in this context is the song Summer Days from Love and
Mm.
Theft, which,
Mm.
and Love and Theft already to me is musically, I think, was Dylan's first very nostalgic sounding album. It's very, I mean, he would say it's not nostalgic, right? But I think like that was kind of was what was evoked for people who heard it for the first time. And I was just thinking about the lyrics because to me they really seem like they're sung from the perspective of someone who's battling with the feeling that his best days are behind him, who is kind of battling the temptation to want to hold on to certain things from the past. It's things, while I'm driving the flats in a Cadillac car, the girls all say you're a worn out star. My pockets are loaded. I'm spending every dime. How can you say you love someone else? It's me all the time. She's looking into my eyes. She's holding my hand. She says, "You can't repeat the past." I say, "You can't." What do you mean you
Right,
can't? Of
right,
course you
right.
can't. Of course you can.
Yeah.
Which is the Great Gatsby. I mean, like that's from the Great Gatsby. But this is exactly what we're talking about, right? But then the song. So I think that is kind of like the vibe of the song, and the music is this rockabilly tune that evokes the days of Dylan's own youth, the 50s. Um, but then it ends on the note where, with a very final gesture of leaving the past behind, when he sings, "Well, I'm leaving in the morning as soon as the dark clouds lift, gonna break in the roof, set fire to the place as a parting gift." And then it ends with, "Summer days, summer nights are gone. I know a place where there's still something going on." So he moves on. He decides not to repeat the past. He decides to instead go to a different place where there's still something going on, where there's still something
Well,
to explore.
I think the first verse and the last verse are identical, but they're different, right? Like it's like I know a place that things are going on, but then he goes through this entire song where it's like, no,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, you're
not what
right.
he's
Yeah.
doing. And I think that the idea of a blues lyric that's a traditional setup, but then the way he's able to every non-repeated line is so punchy, like
Hmm.
it's so
Hmm.
inventive and so
Yeah.
creative. I mean, it's a master class of that. And then, of course, we could get into Eric Lott and minstrelsy and love and theft and all of that, which all plays directly into this, right? The idea of the American nostalgic past is one based around fictional, a minstrel fiction that was sold as a fiction at the time that becomes seen as the truth by the same people a generation later. That's the complex discourse that's going on here. It's not just like, oh, this is a song that sounds like blah 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 blah. It's embedded in all of these things, and he's very key. Dylan's very good at kind of playing within this
Yeah.
uh, in a way that is also inventive. Yeah.
And I would also add to that, what I find so fascinating is, I mean, the album, and I only know this from other people who have explained this to me because I'm not American, but obviously it engages with so many themes of the American past. And I think a lot of people back then were saying, oh, this is almost like a new kind of basement tapes uh, way of kind of looking at the American past. And then, Eric Lott and minstrelsy plays into this. But he is also writing these sometimes quite like pastoral songs, which evoke this kind of like American small town pre-modern life. Uh, but he does so by also taking bits and pieces from authors like Junichi Saga, who writes about Japanese pre-modern life,
Mm.
and the Confessions of a Yakuza, and he weaves these into his songs, which are kind of like very American. And I think that again also challenges this idea of, what exactly is history, and isn't, what reads as one thing can actually be made up of all these disparate sources, and can be a melting pot. And I actually think that is a really beautiful metaphor for, what he's trying to do on Love and Theft, particularly the theft and love part.
Yeah, and this idea too that then he does Timrod with Modern Times, like
Yes.
he's there. It's a really fascinating thing. But then this idea I was thinking about, like you look at the track listing and it's like Charlie Patton and Summer Day in Mississippi, right?
Mhm.
And Sugar Baby, which ends with like, got to move forward, right? That's a kind of the
Mhm.
end thing too. And it's that idea of like moving forward is just a fiction as looking back in some ways, right? It's like it just
Mhm.
depends on where you put your marker of like, well, this is where we're going to be headed, which goes back, of course, to our famous philosopher Don Draper, which is there's only one way. It's moving forward. But and we won't get into this. It's a whole other thing I've been playing with for too long. But this idea of like a composite past that you've built. You haven't built your past. You've built your present away from your past. Whether it's Don Draper and Dick Whitman, or where it's Bob Dylan and Robert
Mhm.
Zimmerman. There's a reason why this stuff keeps coming up, and there's a reason why Gatsby plays looms large in all of this too.
Mhm.
This
Mhm.
kind of I mean, I think for some reason we all the stuff is so apparent. It's like so obvious. Like his invention is a self invention is so on the surface. It's not hidden, and yet we're
Yeah.
all, oh, can you believe that? Yeah, of course. I mean, all of this, and I think the best part about this is that in many ways there's no answer to it, right? It's not like there's an answer or like a hidden key to it, but I do think it does help explain why, certainly from Love and Theft onward, I think Time Out of Mind is a little, uh, I think that's a little trickier to figure out. But well, maybe you could go back to the acoustic records. Maybe that's the beginning point when you look at World Gone Wrong. Maybe there's a beginning there. I mean, in some ways, I would argue that where there's like
Or
a
maybe
kind of a
there is no fan beginning,
exactly,
Maybe
exactly.
it's
There is no linear time. Right,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right, right, right. It's like when he gets to his debut in a few years, we're going to really see how it all plays out. But I think there's something
Well,
to that in another way too.
I agree. Well,
It's like,
th sorry,
I mean,
go
you were
on.
saying that the songs exist in the ever present, right? Like he's
Mhm.
playing. Like I was fortunate enough to see two shows in April. I saw Tyler, Texas, and I saw Abilene, Texas.
Mhm.
And what he's doing with like All in the Watchtower, which is perhaps his most played song, right? It's one of those
Mhm.
famous. And what he's doing now is so great. Like that song's a new song. And I
Mhm.
hadn't heard the new version. I'd heard it some tapes, but I hadn't experienced the new version of it. I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Not to mention all the tweaks he's doing with Rough and Rowdy Ways and all that kind of stuff. But he's clearly, we want to see it as static because the songs aren't changing, but he doesn't see it as static at all, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think these songs are the songs he wants to present, whether it's like as a play or as a theatrical thing. But he's also within those songs. I mean, his band now is stripped down to two guitar players who only play acoustic guitar. That is, I know it sounds funny to say this, but it's pretty radical compared to the sounds he's been making with this same group of songs 5 years ago or whatever it was.
Yeah.
What I think that's the part that loses you. And if you see him over and over and over again, if you're reading the reviews, it might gloss over the fact that he is doing something really inventive and that these songs live in this world. Who knows what he's going to do with the summer tours? But I mean, I think that's part of that. And to get back to the nostalgic bit, this is where it's so clear is the expectations of the audience that
Yeah.
want. I mean, there's also that great interview we saw with Paul McCartney talking about how oh, it's
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
oh, it's Tambourine Man or whatever. But that
that one song.
expectation from the audience is not on his mind. I don't think it's even on his radar. I don't think it's on his radar even to be contrarian necessarily. But I do think these are the things that he's presenting and he wants to present.
I think when you're Bob Dylan, I can only imagine I think trying to anticipate what the people want is always a losing game
Yeah,
because there will be some people who want one thing and other people who want another thing. And I mean, again, all I can be is me, whoever that is. And in the end, the only way to I'm reminded of a quote that I think Phoebe Bridges said once, where she said, "You got to be careful never to do something that you hate, because what if you get famous doing the one thing that you
right,
hate?"
right.
And then people expect you to do that over and over again. And I think that's kind of the case too with someone. I mean, I can only imagine if Bob Dylan tried to anticipate what people want and landed on, oh, they want me to play all my hit songs exactly as I do them on the album, and for some weird reason decided to start doing that, he would be unhappy pretty soon, I would imagine, or bored. I mean, and then maybe he wouldn't want to be touring anymore, and then who's served by that, right? So I Rebecca was saying this in our recent conversation. We were talking about all these tribute shows that were being held for Bob Dylan's birthday, and she said that she finds that the crowds that come to these tribute shows are often a much more nostalgic crowd than the ones who actually go to see Bob Dylan live.
Hmm.
And I mean, and that's the thing, if you want the nostalgia route with Bob Dylan, go see a cover band. Chances are they're going to sound more like the album than Bob Dylan himself.
No.
And I think there's like a really funny irony in that. I enjoy that.
No, absolutely. I think there's something really, really into that. It's like the expectation. And it's also to go back to McCartney, who's such in the news right now. But
Mhm.
McCartney's also an entertainer in a way that Dylan never wanted to be.
Yeah.
So McCartney wants to give you 3 hours or whatever it is of Beatles and Wings tunes. And that's a whole other story in terms of how he got to that point. But that's what he wants to do. And that's what he
Yeah.
sees himself
He's
as.
enjoying it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then
And
like
for
whatever the Boys of Dungeon Lane's going to be is that's a real kind of nostalgic trip for himself. But then again, Paul was talking about, he wrote Penny Lane when he was like 24. So there's a
Mhm.
long history of him kind of reckoning with his own stuff too. So I don't want to be too superficial with him or dismissive of him either. But there's something really interesting. And going back to the point you made, Dylan's voice requires you to, if he does a Christmas record or whatever, you have to confront his voice. But now with the SNL performance, and SNL performances are always notoriously the bad sound, but people were really talking about how bad McCartney's voice was. And then, like
Poor
Dungeon
Paul.
Lane, if you listen to those new songs, his voice is clearly not what it was. And that forces you to reckon with your relationship to the Beatles. It
Yeah.
requires you to have a reckoning with your own sort of, well, he didn't sound like this when I first heard him when I was 9.
Yeah.
And that,
Well, because you cannot hold on to uh the past. Even if you wanted to recreate the album recording, you're also a human being and mortal, and things change. And this brings me to, what is my when it comes down to probably my favorite Bob Dylan quote: everything passes, everything changes, just do what you think you should do. And I think that is what Bob Dylan has chosen as his motto with his live performances as well. It's like, things will always change, and the audiences will change, and the artist changes. So the only thing that you can do is to stay true to yourself and do what you think you should do, and be true to what you see as your purpose, or what you see as your path,
mm,
and walk in that direction. And if you do that truthfully and honestly and with conviction, you it won't steer you too wrong.
yeah, and I think there are these moments when it's such a great quote, and it's like there's another quote when he says something about like he pining for the past doesn't interest him. Like that's such a great.
Hmm.
But then you start, like you mentioned the basement tapes, but if you go back to like certainly the 75 Rolling Thunder, like he's playing within the same sandbox, but he's not creating the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
There's the expectation of they see Joan Baez and they have an expectation of what that's going to be.
So true. Yeah.
And that never, he never, I mean, we don't have to deal with that, but he would have to deal with that constantly of being put in the spot, which goes back to what he used to announce himself on stage as, right? I think that was a way
Hmm.
of playing with that too. Uh,
Totally.
is the civil rights voice of a generation or whatever it
Hmm.
is. But before we completely bounce off of this, you had mentioned in passing in an email about the visual art, and I
Oh
think
yeah.
um, Laura, we have the Odyssey. We got the Nobel in there. We got Mother, no, not Mother Muses. We got
My own version of you.
my own version of you, and now we get the visual art. It's the
All
greatest
the
hit.
hits.
Yeah, but the visual art, I know you're really keen on a lot of that. I'm thinking of like Mondo Scripto and stuff like that. But if you look at like the beaten path, which a lot of those are not all of that, and there's a lot of that are also not in that collection, but the film stills where
Mhm.
he's seeing a
Deep focus.
film and then this is a scene from, and there's so much detective work that Warmoth and others have done, which is so fun. It's like, oh, this is a scene from this noir, blah 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 blah.
Mhm.
And this is something I'm working with for the upcoming conference that we're going to both be at. But this idea of like, well, how does that play? Is that a movie that he just liked? Is that a scene? Because is this a scene that's particularly important to him? Did he just like it visually? These are the things that I think are really interesting in the visual art of these paintings or sketches, like the process of him sketching and then whatever it is,
Mhm.
it's revisiting something that he obviously had some connection to. Mondo Scripto is different, of course, because those are his own songs, but
Well,
it's fascinating.
Court, I actually once wrote an essay for a certain collection that you and Erin Callahan edited about Dylan's set lists.
Yes,
And I wrote an
I've
essay
heard
for
of
that
it.
collection, which is a great book. It's behind me somewhere. Um, it is somewhere. I can't see
Is it
it
in
right now.
paperback yet?
I have the hardback, I have the proper one. So you edited a great collection of essays about Bob Dylan set lists, and my contribution was kind of only half about set lists, and I'm so sorry about that. I kind of just took that as a jumping off point
Really, this is a
to write
suggestion,
about something. Yeah, to write about something I wanted to write about, and I wrote about Bob Dylan's relationship with time
right?
in the 2020s in particular, and I think that that is very much related to the conversation that we're having, right? I mean, we're talking about the past with nostalgia, we're talking about the future, and I think in my essay I was kind of making the case that something that he said. I mean, he described it at some point in the 70s where he told someone that he's not hung up on the past. He always tries to keep the past, the present, and the future all on the same level. And I
Mm.
think that that is actually something that we can
Right.
really kind of take as a way of summing up everything that we've spoken about here. And I think, and my thesis in that, or my, do you say thesis? Yeah,
Thesis.
yeah, of the
Strongly felt
essay.
argument.
My
Yes.
argument, yeah, of the essay was that, yeah, Bob Dylan is currently really thinking about time and stretching it and collapsing it in the way that he writes and in the way that he performs. And I think his visual art is an extension of that. And I think that to take a movie and condense it in one image, it is also a way of making time stand still. And I believe that this is something that he has at least thought about. I don't know if this is necessarily, if this was necessarily a conscious decision when he was working on this series. This is a deep focus series,
Right. Yeah.
but but in a way, I do actually think that he considered that, because deep focus is this technique in shooting movies where the background, the middle ground, and the foreground are all equally in focus. So the
Mhm.
camera doesn't tell you what to look at, but kind of lets you choose what to focus on. And the fact that he chooses these film stills and lets our eye wander across the different planes, and kind of it is a way of collapsing time, and it is a way of making time stand still. And I mean, I don't want to. I don't know. I'm tempted to basically say, and just sum up my whole essay. That particular part, actually, where I talk about the visual art, just for the listeners, that I delivered that as a paper, and it's on the YouTube channel if you're interested.
It's on the YouTube.
It's on the YouTube. I took that an excerpt from the essay and delivered it as a paper at the Retrospectrum exhibition in Florida.
But what you're talking about though, and what you're arguing is so great because I think when you look at like the conversation around like his connection to like Norman Rabin and his painting is
Hmm.
often seen as kind of like not always, but it's seen in the realm of like his identities, right? The masking or the identities, or like with Picasso, where you're able to see 30 different parts of a person in one flap. But it's the time issue that I think is equally as important.
Yeah.
And the idea of deep focus, which is like, okay, we're talking about Citizen Kane, literally, but it's also like what does that mean? And the way he's being, that's what's so great about him sometimes is that all the time is like the kind of smart but playful. Is like a lot of his collections have like puns in them, but then it's like Deep
Yeah.
Focus, I guess, is a pun, but it's
Yeah.
also
He
not. He's
he
like, no, it's something else.
yeah, he loves I love that he has been naming almost all of his visual art series with kind of these like idioms.
Hmm.
So it's what's it called? Well, the latest one is called Point Blank, but
Point Blank, yeah.
before that it was drawn
Drawn Blank.
blank, drawn blank, right? And then
What's the one with
face
the
value, face
face
value
value
was the
faces?
portraits,
What's
and
the gate one? The gate one has a funny name.
oh yeah, 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 mood swings because the
Mood
gates.
swings. Yeah,
Yeah, mood swings. Yeah, it's
it's so
very
good.
funny. It's
Yeah,
very and it's very playful, and I think he's just having fun with it, and I like that. Before we conclude, I want to say one more thing about Bob Dylan and Don Draper, because the two things that I think they have in common is that they're both Geminis,
right.
Bob Dylan and Don Draper, and they both believe in creating themselves,
Yes,
inventing themselves.
100%. 100%. I just posted this thing that someone figured out where Don Draper's village apartment was and where that was close to Dylan's village apartment.
Mm.
And it's like how they could be walking into one another. And then a friend of mine responded to that and said, "How angry did it make you that someone thought of that before you?" And I was like,
Livid.
just yeah, just like the embers will not die in my anger for not ever thinking that through. But there's also if you want to talk about the collapse of the past, the end of season one when Don is confronting like the two opposite, the sliding door moment
Mhm.
of Mad Men, when it's like, oh, he said no, he's not gonna go to Thanksgiving with his family, and then he comes home and his family's there, and you're like, oh yay, he figured it out. And
Mhm.
this is after the nostalgia conversation, the cell, and this is
Mhm.
wonderful. And then you realize, no, he's alone, and then
Yeah.
it's Dylan starts playing, and
Mhm.
immediately
Devastating.
it's devastating. And
Don't
I
think
remember
twice. It's
even
all
at the time,
right.
what's that?
Don't think twice. It's all right.
Yeah,
Is the
yeah.
song is playing. Yeah.
Don't think twice. And then immediately, I remember even at the time, some were like, "Well, that's 1963, and this is set in November of 1960." But it's like I think, which I appreciate the.
Very few people care.
You're like, just wait till they play the Decemberists in the next season. But this idea of like yes, but that constriction of time and that playing with time and that idea of nonlinear time, that's all embedded
Mhm.
in that same moment. And I don't think it makes you into a complete scold to say that's really cool to see how this plays into it, and that Draper as a construct, Draper as moving forward, Draper, and there's a lot of Dylan call outs in the show. There's some obvious
Mm.
ones, but there's also some less obvious ones. And I think that there's a reason why all that sort of resonates. And of course, the Gemini thing.
Yeah. And Don't Think Twice Is All Right is also such a, I mean, brilliant song choice, apart from the fact that it hadn't been released at that point, because and this fits our conversation as well. I mean, as you say, it's after Don gives this pitch that's very nostalgic. It's the wheel, right? The
It's a carousel.
the carousel, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's a
Right.
time machine. It moves
The
forward. Yeah,
time
yeah,
machine. Yeah, it's like a pitch for what's was it, Kodak?
yeah.
Or yeah, and he gives this presentation with all the nostalgic family shots, and then afterwards he,
Yes.
as you already said, like there are these two versions of how it could have played out, the one where he would have reunited with his family, and then the reality where he didn't. And the song choice is so perfect, and it's so Dylan, because I think in that moment Don has the choice whether or not to get hung up on the way things went, right? Whether or not to deeply regret that he didn't manage to go home in time to reunite with his family, or to move forward, to move on, right? And the song is telling him, don't think twice, it's all
Yeah.
right. And in a way, it's astounding that, I mean, this is one of the songs, one of the several songs that astounds me that Dylan wrote them when he was so young, because there's such a wisdom in the song Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And also it it still it's still so him. I mean,
Yeah.
it he's still the same person. And speaking of collapsing time, right? I mean, and that's why he is still performing that song. I mean, even though it might sound a little
Right.
different now, but he can
Yeah.
still he can still tap into the emotions of that song, and which is fundamentally a very non-nostalgic song,
Betty
unnostalgic.
uses, you just wasted my precious time. But then also the idea that Draper is coming in the front door, the transom, and then he's not completely in his house. He's sitting on his steps that are going up, and you're seeing him with
Hmm.
the steps going up, but that's upstairs, and then he's looking out, and then that song's playing. I mean, the more you think about it, there's a whole dissertation of time that's embedded right there. But especially if you bring the nostalgia into it and his connection to his own life, the way Dylan's song plays on its own, and that's where film or television can, at its best, can play out, because then it's playing out the DNA of the song you're hearing, but it's also playing out the DNA of the scene you're watching and how those
Hmm.
things touch and intermesh. And of course, ultimately, what you want to see is something bigger than each of those things,
Hmm.
in terms of art. And I think that that's such a good example. And this idea of, is he wistful, or is he, like you saying, is he like fare thee well?
Hmm.
That I think is the key story. And what Madman does so well, and what Dylan does so well, is he doesn't have to give you, this isn't what I'm thinking. Here's the genius.com comment. Is like, you're left with all of this. Then you have to sit with the ambiguity and the ambivalence
Hmm.
you feel watching that scene.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Next, for our
Good
next two
stuff.
hours on Mad Men, we have
Only 2 hours. I think we can probably go for longer
we'll
than
give
that.
your listeners a break. Guys, you were a show from 15 years ago. It's great. It's great. It mentions Dylan a couple of times. Settle in.
It's yeah, mostly Mad Men.
Well, this was great, Laura. This was I think we touched on things.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for this conversation. I
Well,
really, I,
I'm
I,
glad
I
I didn't make
really,
it under make the cut for the other one, but I get this one. So